Hi everyone, and welcome back to Massacre on Muriel Court. This is episode 11, a chat with Jeremy Mutz. A few weeks ago I had the pleasure of speaking with former Assistant State Attorney Jeremy Mutz, whom you've learned a lot about throughout this podcast. He worked as an Assistant State Attorney for the 2nd Judicial Circuit of Florida from 2003 to 2016 and was part of the quote-unquote task force that was created in 2016 to reopen the Sims case, but was broken up just before Jeremy Mutz was abruptly fired by State Attorney Willie Meggs. Reasons for his dismissal have never really been 100% clear. But it seems to me that Jeremy Mutz is one of the only people that has ever come close to gathering enough evidence to actually make an arrest in the Sims case. So keep in mind as you listen to this interview and listen to what Jeremy has to say that he worked inside this system for almost 13 years. In the interview, you'll notice we start by discussing the Blue Sink murders, Granville Baker, and some of the scenarios I brought up in episode 9, Tallahassee doesn't like to deal with messy, and then move on from there and discuss in depth Jeremy's ideas and opinions about why the Sims case hasn't been solved yet. I think you'll find what Jeremy has to say very interesting when it comes to the inner workings of the Tallahassee government, and especially the Sims case.
It's mostly quiet on Muriel Court, but that wasn't the case in 1966 when Robert Sims, his wife Helen, and young daughter Joy found gagged, stabbed, and shot to death.
Safer politically to leave it alone. Moronic is the word that comes to mind.
He's accusing two top officials of a cover-up.
Standing back there under the banana tree.
Surveillance video of a 1966 FSU football game may be the key to cracking the code in this case gone cold.
You do that.
And while state officials aren't releasing details regarding suspects or persons of interest, it did stress their commitment to finding the Sims killers.
Oh, I think you did it. All of a sudden you became absolutely down, totally obsessed with that.
It's a case that we would certainly like to see solved, and investigators are actively working on the case.
So I have with me today Jeremy Mutz, who is former Assistant State Attorney in Leon County, the 2nd Judicial Circuit. Jeremy, just for my listeners, what is your background? What's your experience? How are you involved here?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. It's an honor. I really appreciate it. I was a prosecutor for 12 and a half years in Tallahassee and Apalachicola, and I tried everything from driving without a license up to first-degree murder, and did a lot of work on serious felony, domestic violence cases and things like that. And my work on the Sims case really was completely an accidental thing. I got interested in it because it was in the media in 2015. WCTV was the local television station, did a little piece on the 49th anniversary of the crime. And then you also had a local writer who was trying to write a book about the Sims case for several years, Henry Cabbage, and he did a little presentation at the City Hall in Tallahassee. And I walked away from that meeting and I walked away from that report on the news just kind of being intrigued by the case. But I felt like, they'll probably never solve that because it's so old. And our chief investigator at the state attorney's office had a box of files in the office, and he was really one of the legends that worked on this case at a period of time. It was reopened in the 80s. And he said, if you ever want to look at those files, you can. And I was like, I'm pretty busy. And because I had a day-to-day caseload and things like that of supervising younger attorneys and my own cases as well. And I was like, I don't think so. But then one day at lunch, I was just thinking about the case, and I went by the house where it occurred, and I just kind of looked at the house, and it sort of pulled me in. I'm like, you know what? This needs to be solved. I mean, this is the the worst case that's happened in Tallahassee, and it really needs to be solved. And I went back to the chief investigator, said, I'd like to look at those files. And, it just, history goes on from there, I guess.
So first thing I want to do is thank you for being awake this early and up for an interview at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning.
Well, that's quite all right. We get up pretty early here with the chickens and stuff, and so that's quite all right.
So, as I mentioned in the email I sent you yesterday, I was trying to do research on the Blue Sink murders, and I did find what you sent me that
Cope. I've seen different spellings of it, but it's pronounced Cope.
Now, I saw that he was interviewed in the Sims case, but I couldn't find anything with him connecting him to Blue Sink.
And you won't. It's kind of like the unwritten history. I mean, if you look at, a good parallel maybe is the Charlie Wall killing in Tampa in 1955. The history that you find in the newspapers is different from what, some of the interviews of detectives have said 50, 60 years later when they were free to speak about it. And I heard this from a retired police department sergeant in Tallahassee who was a detective at the time in 66, 67. And he said that after the Blue Sink murders in 67, of course, with the young women that were killed, an FHP state trooper pulled over a second suspect somewhere in the area, and he was suspicious. He got him out of the car, looked in the trunk, and found like a trunk full of knives with some blood on them, things like that. And the man was named Cope, and it might have been Cope. It might have been Kaupe. And you do see in the canvases of the Sims case that this person lived not too far from the Parkside area, Monticello Drive and Muriel Court. And he was, on the radar screen of the police department at that time. And the detective Cooper Donnelly said that the state trooper ultimately was reassigned after this. He was sent to another part of the state, and the individual was never charged in the Blue Sink's case, and the part that we do know, that played out in the media and was made public was that the man named Sanders was ultimately tried, found not guilty by reason of insanity. I think he did something like 6 or 7 years in the state mental facilities, and then he was released. He was out, probably before the dawn of the 1980s, if I remember correctly.
Right.
And so all of this is just kind of the stuff that was never reported, and it's just kind of these things that, if you gain the trust of people that were involved and knew about it, you can find out, but it never went anywhere. The state trooper was reassigned, so these were, it was kind of hushed up, and nobody could really, it's one of those things that if you wanted to stay in law enforcement and not get fired, you had to let those things go.
So it seems to me after the research that I've done that it was just easier to prosecute Sanders, even though, it says that his quote confession was not even recorded. It wasn't even written down in shorthand. And I know that his attorney, Wadsworth, had objected to that strongly because Sheriff Joyce really had no proof that he confessed, but they still entered it in at trial and he was convicted. I guess, he pled guilty or not guilty, but he made a confession. It's just so convoluted. I can't it just seems like Sanders was the easier target, the easier one to just get it over with and get it done and over.
Well, it definitely fits the pattern for Sheriff Joyce and how things operated in the Tallahassee system. I won't single out Joyce necessarily. You could kind of say it's the Tallahassee system. They'd go after the low-hanging fruit, have a nice case that they could put in a box and tie it with a bow and be done. And you just see that pattern over and over again for whatever reason. And you go back in Tallahassee to 1949, the Granville Baker case, and Baker was a very wealthy person, and there was a big plantation north of town, hunting plantation that he was at, and famous people would visit that plantation. As I recall, I think the Duke of Windsor and other people that prominent would go there. But one night he was riding with a car hop waitress and had an accident, and she comes back and says, the Jeep rolled over and he was hurt. Well, the authorities get there, and Granville Baker is indeed deceased, but in addition to the normal injuries you'd expect from a rollover accident in an open car, he had a bullet hole in his head, but that was somehow ruled a car accident, and I'm not a doctor, but, generally if you have a bullet hole in your head, that's probably going to be the cause of death,
Yeah.
It's not conducive with, maintaining life, but they ruled that a car accident, and probably because they didn't want to create a mess for one prominent family or another, or maybe it was because of the connections of the car hop. But you had the state attorney, Bill Hopkins, rule that was an accident, and like it's been said, a state attorney can indict a ham sandwich. Well, they didn't even try to indict anybody. And then you go to the Blue Sink case. I think they took the easier suspect. They tried it and they were done with it. They did the same thing in the 68 riots. After Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, there were riots in Tallahassee, and one incident occurred. A fire was set at a little store, and I think unbeknownst to the perpetrators, there was somebody upstairs asleep in the building who was killed. And again, the sheriff's office crowd, I think Hamlin might have been the sheriff at that time. By then, they just wanted to go after a couple suspects and not go any further. And Cooper Donnelly, who I mentioned, had a lot of evidence of other people involved in it. And, instead of them saying, thank you, let's go after the other people as well, he was ostracized and told to lay off. And it continues to the present day. The Dan Markell murder in 2014, you had a state attorney that didn't want to approve the search warrants, didn't want to arrest the trigger man and the driver, the female that was the go-between, Miss Magbanua. And why would you do that? Well, maybe it's because you just don't want to deal with a messy case. And that seems to be the Tallahassee pattern. And, there may be other explanations for some of these things and so forth, but it just seems like they want nice and neat things, and they don't want to be bothered with something that can be complex or messy and bring in a lot of big attorneys that are going to, really have to make them work to get a conviction. And
right.
It's kind of baffling to people thinking, why would you be afraid of that? Like, if you have to try two people in the Blue Sink cases, why is that such a big deal? Who knows? It's maybe.
Can I ask you, as a former prosecutor, why? I mean, is it a huge pain? Is it, too much work? Can you think of any reason why they wouldn't want to prosecute?
It really is kind of baffling to me. I mean, it is obviously a lot of work. If you have, let's say the Granville Baker case, let's say a relative of his was involved, you'd have a big case with big attorneys from out of town, and it would, be a major event. Maybe they just didn't want to deal with that. The thing with the Blue Sinks, maybe it was a connected person. Maybe this Cope was a confidential informant or something. I mean, I've seen that happen over the years where, somebody commits a serious crime, but because this person was a confidential informant in other cases, law enforcement may not go after them. And that certainly happened before. and Markell, the big attorneys that would come in. And you have to understand, Willie Meggs dealt with a lot of media attention and attorneys on the Jameis Winston situation and had that press conference. And I don't think he liked what he went through in that with national media, with all these attorneys coming in. And I don't think he looked too good after all that. I don't think he liked it. And I don't think he wanted to go through that again with Markell. The reasons are probably more complex than that. I think that's one explanation for this pattern. And I think it applies to Sims that, that there are different reasons they didn't want to open up this whole Pandora's box. But it's still baffling to me as a prosecutor because murder cases are difficult no matter what. And some serious felony cases, many serious felony cases are difficult no matter what. So you're a prosecutor, you sign up for that. I mean, it's almost kind of like if you're a surgeon, you sign up. Like if you're in an emergency type physician, surgeon, you sign up for gunshot wounds and, repairing arteries and removing bullets and stuff.
Yeah.
What if a surgeon said, you know what, I got one bullet out of you, but I just don't want to mess with the other one. And there probably are some
going to let you die.
Or just going to leave that bullet in you, And, there are some medical people out there that are kind of like that. They're like, if you go to a doctor that doesn't want to operate on you and says, well, you'll just have to walk with a cane. You tore your ACL, you're probably just going to have to walk with a cane. You're in your 30s or 40s. You have an active life. You go get a second opinion and the other physician says, you know what, I'll operate and you'll be back to playing tennis. You'll be back to, running with your kids and everything. No problem. And so I think it's just human nature. There are differences between law enforcement prosecutors, some that would go no matter what the evidence is, no matter how hard, they're going to go forward for the victims. But I guess there are others that say, put the finger to the wind and say, man, does this case help me politically? If not, I'm not going to get into it. Am I going to have to work really hard? Am I going to have to work 14-hour days to make this case? Well, maybe I don't want to do that. And, am I going to be embarrassed by media attention? Big attorneys coming to town. And that seems baffling to people, but I think there are some people that make that calculation and they decide, I would rather go to the plantation in Tallahassee and drink with my buddies or, go out on the golf course or fish or, just enjoy the trappings of the office rather than, take on some of these cases. And I think, that is a real calculation that some of these people make.
I agree. And just side note, I've talked about it a lot on our other podcast and different, Patreon stuff, but I always try and hammer home that these people are all human. Attorneys, prosecutors, judges, everyone involved is all human. They have their own motives. Our justice system is so far from perfect. You just hammered that home for me right there, that there are prosecutors that would rather be on the golf course than deal with a tough case. And I don't know, is the Second Judicial Circuit just like a magnet for those kind of people? I mean, what's going on there? It shows a pattern, like you said, all the way back to 49. And here we are in 2022. And as far as the Markell case, the brother and the wife and the mother were just arrested this year in 2022.
8 years later.
Yeah. Why did it take 8 years to arrest these people who orchestrated this murder and paid for it?
And it was obvious back in 2016 that they were involved, and there was plenty of evidence by that time. And you look at some of the things that happened with the probable cause reports being sealed, and then somehow they get unsealed, unbeknownst to the police department. And then you have an elected state attorney at one point invite the Adelson family to sue the police department for false arrest or something like that, malicious prosecution.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, the first release of documents were undesired by the police department. They wanted to keep their reports sealed because when they arrested, they arrested Rivera and Garcia first. I can't remember the order now, but they didn't want to tip off Magmanua, Charlie Adelson, or anyone else that they might feel like they had enough to arrest. But somebody apparently got word to the judge that it was okay to release those reports, and the judge signed an order to release them, to unseal them. And then the police department's counsel had to get word to the judge that they objected to that and to reseal them. But of course, by then they're public, and if any evidence might have been still available then, they could dump phones, they could dump burner phones, they could do things like that, flee the country. And so they really thought that was a real problem to their case. Then later on, the police department was accused by the state attorney of leaking documents to pressure him. And I think that was in the fall of 2016. And the state attorney said, go ahead and arrest him. You don't need me, but get ready for a lawsuit. And that's never happened before in the history of the state of Florida, where an elected prosecutor would invite people to sue the police department, his local police department that he, doesn't have a caseload in his office without, and he invites them to be sued, by the people that would be arrested. So
that's crazy.
Why all that? Is it just the ego that, I don't want this done and I'm just not going to listen? I mean, it's almost like a child when you say, we're going to do this today, and they just decide they're not going to do it. And no matter what you say, I don't want to do it. No. And it's kind of like, it's like, is it just an antipathy toward the police department? And some of this is just so inside baseball at Tallahassee that I'm sure people's eyes probably would just glaze over. But there's a long history of the sheriff wanting to be the top dog in law enforcement in Leon County. And they didn't even want the police department to have their own detectives back in the old days.
Right.
The sheriff's office. Willie came up through that. Hamlin was his mentor, and they all believe, the sheriff is number one. And so is it because they just don't want the police department to make this case against the Adelsons and get good press in an election year? I mean, I don't know. Because it's just, you're trying to explain something that really doesn't make any sense.
And I think that's what I'm trying to do here. My main focus in this podcast is the Sims murder, but it branches off in so many different directions because there's so many other wheels turning that come back to what went wrong with the Sims case. And what you're talking about right now is just the pattern of Tallahassee not wanting to deal with Messi, and the sheriff, whether it be Joyce or whoever came after, even Larry Campbell. I mean, there's a pattern of the Leon County Sheriff's Office shutting out Tallahassee PD. I mean, we've found that in Blue Sink. We found that in several different cases. I've found that. And Joyce was upset with Tallahassee Police Department when they decided that they were going to make their own detective division. Why would you not want help?
They never got over that. And is it just a question of turf? If one bureaucracy feels another bureaucracy is growing bigger, that's a loss to them. Is that what it was, or just personal jealousy, or was it a lack of control? Because, I mean, let's be completely honest about what was going on in Florida in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Moonshine was pretty much everywhere.
Right.
And, many of the sheriffs had little deals with the moonshiners. And, every year they do a raid and they get it in the paper. And, it's a raid, wink, wink, nod, nod. And they make the papers, they pour out the liquor on Monroe Street, and then they go back to business as usual. And that was not unique in Leon County. I work over in Washington County, and that was considered the wettest dry county in the state. There was moonshine everywhere. And that's the world that they lived in. And in the 50s, some of the deputies would even deliver the moonshine in their cars on duty. And, I think the police chief was Stoudemeyer in the late 50s. His officers would go deliver his eggs from his farm, and they'd go collect his rents for him because he was a landlord. And, when you have your life set up that way, you don't want somebody coming along and saying they're going to have their own detectives and we're going to do things kind of like a by the book way. They resent that. They resented Cooper Donnelly being a detective. And, he came to the Sims scene and he was taught keep a notebook in one hand and a pencil in the other so you don't touch things and contaminate the scene. And I think there was just a part of it was, we're the sheriff. We're coming in here. We're going to make coffee. We're going to put our feet up on the seats and we're going to sit here and everybody's going to look at the scene and, this is our crime scene. And I think a lot of it was turf and just, nobody else is going to tell us what to do. And I think that's part of the reason the Sims case, ultimately was not solved back in the 60s. And I think there is a pattern. It didn't happen in a vacuum. And I think these other cases kind of put it into context why perhaps, if it was going to implicate somebody with FSU, that they might have been, told to call off their dogs and not look into it. But the case is also many contradictions because Joyce called in the sheriff's bureau and there were dozens of detectives working on the Sims case. They put more hours into it than any other case ever in Tallahassee. Up until that time, they had a whole room at the courthouse devoted to the Sims case with, things up on the wall. And they went down to South Florida. They sent teams of people to mental hospitals trying to find out if there was a connection. Somebody might have been released. So it's a case of many contradictions. Florida was a state of many contradictions. You had the sheriff that deals with the moonshiners at that time. You had a sheriff that followed Joyce Hamlin, who, I've heard on good authority was, part of the Dixie Mafia. And that was nothing really unusual to him. There were other sheriffs that, in the area, even there was a sheriff in a coastal county that was completely in on the marijuana coming in. So, these are also men that did try to solve cases as well. And so you have all these contradictions, all these layers, all these reasons. I think sometimes that if it was inconvenient, they wouldn't continue to look into a homicide. It's like all these layers of an onion to try to understand Sims and fit it into a context.
So if we just buckle down on the Sims, what are your thoughts on if there was some kind of cover up or if there was some kind of reason why they didn't fully investigate the way they should have or didn't arrest the people that should have been arrested? I just want to know your opinion about why. Because I have my own opinions, but I mean, you, I think, are probably the only person that I know of that has the most intimate knowledge of this case that's willing to talk about it now that Henry Cabbage has passed. So I really am curious about what your thoughts are on that.
Well, the biggest thing that jumps out to me is the prosecutor, longtime prosecutor Bill Hopkins, told law enforcement, I'm getting a lot of calls from these FSU people. So either charge Vernon or lay off. And I think that may be the key to this. I think it may have been something that the evidence either established a link to FSU or it led strongly to that direction such that, they would get phone calls. And by saying FSU, what I mean is the founder of the criminology department, nationally known, famous in all kinds of articles, all kinds of writings at that time, was Vernon Fox Sr. And his son was the, sort of backyard neighbor of the Sims family. And, that's what led to that phone call being made by Bill Hopkins. Law enforcement was looking into Vernon Fox Jr. and that led to FSU people saying, this is going in a direction that's going to shine a spotlight on our guy. And I don't know if it's still on their website, but up at least until several years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, the criminology department at FSU has a page dedicated to their founder, Vernon Fox Sr. So he's a big deal. He was a big deal then and still is. And if his son had been in charge of the murder, that would have been a huge thing. There were press releases written up at the time for the arrest of Vernon Jr. I think it might have been Ron Stock, at that time, Tallahassee Democrat writer. So, law enforcement was seriously looking into Vernon Jr. And whether he did it or not, and whether there was a cover-up or not, I think that may explain it, that people at FSU got wind of it, and they led the prosecutor to make that call. And Bill Hopkins was not a person that was a potted plant. He tried some tough cases, and he was a tough individual. He was, a prosecutor that tried white men for the attack and rape of a black woman in 1959. So, he was not a man that was afraid of taking on a tough case, but he also didn't live in a vacuum. And, he made that call. He was also the one on the Granville Baker case that ruled it was an accident. So, he worked within the system that he had and molded the system that carried on, into the 80s and the 2000s. That's why it shows there is something of a pattern that, they might stop a case investigation if it was going in a way that was not helpful. And all these people are elected officials, so they, nothing else matters if they don't get reelected in their view.
Well, and, when it comes to a big university like FSU, just to kind of branch out a little and then come back, the Penn State scandal, the way that was covered up for years and years and years. And we did a big, I think it might have been a 2 or 3 part episode on our other show, Paradise After Dark, about the missing district attorney, Ray Gricar, who had uncovered a lot of info about Sandusky. And before Sandusky actually was arrested, and Gricar disappeared in 2005. Just disappeared. They found his laptop and the hard drive in a river. They were unable to get anything off of it, and he's still never been found. So I think that what you're saying about FSU, some of these universities, even to this day and back then, are very powerful. And it's not just, hey, don't do that. It's, hey, don't do that or else. Am I wrong?
No, and I think in the case of Pennsylvania, millions of dollars involved in that program. FSU as well. Millions of dollars involved in the football program and the other programs at the university. And without FSU, what is Tallahassee? They're a city with state agencies that in the 60s and 70s, there were still talk about moving the capital to Tampa or Orlando. So FSU is a serious thing, a serious part of Tallahassee. And, all those things come together. Also, Fox was the one in charge of education for local law enforcement.
Right. So, I mean, if you just lay it out in plain English, if Vernon Fox Jr. committed this murder, how embarrassing would that be for Vernon Fox Sr. and the institution? Because Vernon Fox Sr. he laid out the education for all the police and wrote the books, the criminology books, the textbooks. How would it look if his own son committed this murder? But okay, so here we are. How would it look if his son committed this whole murder? But how does it look now that his own son possibly got away with it?
Well, and I think there's even more to it than the statement by the prosecutor, Mr. Hopkins. The kid gloves, really, that Fox Sr. were shown and Jr. was shown. For instance, when Fox Jr. came to do the polygraph, he complained the chest piece hurt him and things like that. How many other people would they just let them take the test without putting the chest piece on? I mean, if you or I were brought in and they wanted us to take a polygraph, do you think they would say, well, gee, Jeremy, I guess it is a little tight on your chest. We'll take that off. Why don't you just do it?
And tight on his chest, he was what, like 130 pounds? He was not a big guy.
And they let his father, I think, stay in the hallway while they did the test. So, Larry Campbell was apparently a student of Fox Sr., so you had that connection as well. And I'm just going to put this out there because of the facts that we do know and let people draw their own conclusions. Years later, Larry Campbell, who, at the time of the Sims murders was a 25-year-old deputy sheriff, he was not the lead on the case, as, many people, kind of by default, he's the last man standing when we get into the 80s or 90s, but he was part of a team at the time. But years later, he admitted to being untruthful about the degrees that he had. I think he said he had a master's degree and so forth when he was running for office. And then he later admitted he only had one degree, bachelor's degree from FSU, and Fox Sr. would have been over that. So did something happen with those degrees? You have somebody ultimately admit to being untruthful about what they have, so apparently it's an important thing to him to have a degree. Are you going to go arrest the son of the guy that's going to award you the degree that you do have?
Right.
Those, I'm talking about actual facts in the media, where Larry Campbell ultimately admitted that. So you have somebody who's a big deal. I mean, if you look at another profession, if you have one nursing school in town and you want to get your nursing degree, you want to get your license, there's one person in town that you're going to go to. I think that gave him a lot of deference and a lot of, treatment with kid gloves that other people, weren't going to get. And I think that, that may explain what happened in the case.
Right. Because even Fox Sr.'s mistress said that Fox Sr. was concerned about Junior's involvement. Am I right about that? I read that in one of the reports.
No, that's exactly right. He worried that his son was with Mary, and Mary Charles LaJoy is who he met. And they kind of terrorized him a little bit too. So think about it too, because in some ways you have to be sympathetic to Fox Sr. because, he was a brilliant man, prominent man. And then his son and his girlfriend basically terrorized him with prank calls, taunting him, things like that. And I think the number one taunt would have been, I'm the big criminology professor and my son and his girlfriend are going to commit a murder right in my backyard. They're going to use all my books as a way to learn how to do this and get away with it. And now I have to kind of help them cover it up because I'm going to lose everything. And so that's like the number one way they can get back at him. And, part of that I think was anger over Vernon Sr. stepping out on his wife, Vernon Jr.'s mother.
Right.
And, so he had reasons to concern, and he ultimately becomes kind of a sloppy drunk. You look at the person that was the hero of the Michigan prison riots in the 50s, and by the 70s, he is, falling down in his front yard drunk.
Yeah.
Urinating on himself in the front yard. So why would a person, devolve like that? Was it guilt over what he knew and maybe what he helped cover up? Was it just how you'd feel? I mean, how awful you'd feel if a child did something like that and you have to kind of live with it. And I think that kind of explains what happened to him.
Right. It's hard to say cover up, because I don't feel like there was a cover up. I think it was just turning a blind eye to the obvious.
It could be that. You also have to look at just the fact that it could be multiple cover-ups here, because, back at the time, they might have said, well, we're just going to stop looking at this because we don't have a lot to go on and we're getting calls from FSU folks. Okay, we'll stop. Then you fast forward maybe to different time periods in the 80s or the mid 2010s. We're going to stop because we're afraid this is going to make us look bad, or we're going to get stuck with this case. Willie Meggs in the 80s, here again is the contradictions. In some ways, he was enthusiastic about the case, reopening it. If they solve it, guess what? We're the heroes. But if we don't solve it, we get stuck with it. So he almost had this like CIA level of secrecy. Like he talked to his chief investigator. Yeah, we're going to look into this, but you can't tell anybody because I'm afraid of getting stuck with this. And you think about that, that's a heck of an attitude about a murder case. But then, of course, in my time frame, we're afraid the sheriff's office could be embarrassed because of this. And, Mike Wood saying there's no political rush to do this. We're afraid the office might be embarrassed. And so there could be multiple cover-ups in the sense that we're concerned about FSU. We're concerned about how our agencies look. We don't want to get stuck with the case that goes bad. And, so it's.
Why hasn't the FDLE stepped in?
They take the view that we don't come in unless we're invited in.
Okay. That's what I thought.
That's been the history of FDLE. Florida does not have a state police as other states do with jurisdiction of their own. They typically, FDLE is invited in as an advisor, is invited in to help, kind of like the FBI would be traditionally. And so they will not, and they have chosen not to just step into this. The police department also, you could say, why don't they come into it? Because if the crime happened today, it would be in the city jurisdiction, and the city would definitely have jurisdiction over it, like the Markell case. That was the police department through and through. The sheriff's office was not involved in that. But the police department maintains the view that, well, back in 66, the sheriff's office took the lead, and we're not going to come into it if we're not wanted. These defined roles that, are a kind of an out for the other agencies really coming into them. Now, when we had a task force put together on the Sims case, FDLE and the police department were very enthusiastic about coming in and helping. But the minute that was dissolved, they're not going to come in where the sheriff's office doesn't want them there.
Well, and that was going to be my next thing I wanted to ask you about. What happened in 2016 with this case, from your point of view? I've read the papers. I've read from your point of view. What happened?
Well, I think the most significant things that happened was when I would share with Willie Meggs the things that I had found in the case, he was actually more enthusiastic than I was. In some ways, he would say, we've got enough to go to a grand jury on this. And I was like, wow, that's great. That, he's enthusiastic about it. I'm like, well, I think we need a little bit more. And, But ultimately, the biggest event that happened was, I think, in January of 2016. And as I recall, Willie directed me, bring in the people from Sheriff's Office, Police Department, and FDLE, and we'll have a task force with the state attorney's office and go forward on this case. And the great thing about that is it would have brought in, a dozen or more investigators at any one time. FDLE committed to it. The police department committed somebody to it. We had the first meeting at the state attorney's office, and, our office was committed to it. A new, fairly young investigator with our office was going to be assigned on it. So it was all lining up that there was going to be more personnel on the Sims case at any time since 1966 to come in and work this case and follow where the evidence leads. And, we were operating under the theory that we had enough to get search warrants. We had enough to go make contact with Vernon Jr. and Mary Charles and interview them and so forth. So that was significant. But then about 3 months went by and nothing was being done. The sheriff's office, the things we had thought that they should do, gathering more evidence and so forth, they had done nothing. And at first, our boss, Mr. Meggs, was angry at them for not doing anything, not doing what they said they would do. And, he said at one point, if they're going to do us that way, then we'll just go alone without them. But then I think that's when the politics started getting involved by around April or so of 2016. And you had a sheriff who was running for re-election, and he was basically appointed sheriff in the wake of Larry Campbell's passing. And then you also had Larry Campbell's son running for state attorney to replace our boss. And neither of these men wanted this case looked at that time with the police department, FDLE, state attorney's involvement in it. And again, it goes back to why, why in the world, if, all these resources are going to be brought to bear, why don't we, go forward and follow where the evidence leads, whatever it may be. If it's, if it exonerates Fox and Mary Charles, awesome. I mean, if it allows us to go interview them and get something new, I mean, why wouldn't they want that? But Jack Campbell took the view, first he said, my daddy was smart. If my daddy couldn't solve it, nobody can solve it. And then Mike Wood said his number one concern was the legacy of Larry Campbell. There's no political rush in doing this. The sheriff's office could look bad. So these gentlemen didn't want this going forward. And I think ultimately they got to Willie and prevailed upon him. Hey, we're in the middle of an election. And these are actual quotes from these people. He's in the middle of an election is what Willie said about Mike Wood. And so, he angrily told us, we're done looking at this. Get back to work on the other stuff. And, so you went from having a real glimmer of hope on this case to just completely slamming the door. And by doing that, it took TPD out of it because they're not going to force their way into something. They can't. And there's no case if you don't have cooperation. And the same with FDLE. They're not going to just go on their own. There might be some limited circumstances where, the governor directs them to look into something, on a corruption level, if it's a local sheriff or state attorney. But a normal homicide case, they're not going to defy the local prosecutor and local sheriff. So it was over by that time.
So what did you uncover when you were working on it? Can you talk about that?
Shockingly enough, in one interview that Willie gave, he said that, and this was in 2016 or so, the case had never been put together and it needs to be put together. And you think about that, what he was saying there. Well, really all I tried to do was put the case together, like he said, and make a timeline, make charts, just kind of put all these facts together side by side and look for patterns, look for inconsistencies, look for lies, just like he would do to get ready for trial or to investigate a case like this where it's so many witnesses and so many moving pieces. So I was able to really hone in on some of the lies that Vernon and his girlfriend told about where they were, things like that. I was able to talk to some people that hadn't been talked to before. And, obviously with the benefit of hindsight, and I'm able to look at this case in a more clinical setting 50 years later in an office instead of, out on the field, out in the car with notes as it's unfolding. I'm able to kind of look back and ask questions to people that weren't asked before, and found some new evidence, some new facts that we didn't know before. Things about where C.A. Roberts was, and things that established his alibi a little bit more solidly. Some things that led us to look more in the direction of Vernon, and little pieces, admittedly, but that helped build the mosaic of the case. And when I took all these findings to Willie and these connections and some of this analysis, that's when he said he felt like we had enough to go to a grand jury right then and there. And I thought that was huge, after 50 years. And here's the prosecutor, he's the man saying, we have enough. And so little things. I mean, I didn't find any, smoking gun, but certainly just doing the painstaking, maybe boring to some people work of just sifting through thousands of pages of documents and building a timeline. There were new things that came as well, because I was able to get Vernon talking, online.
Yeah.
I would post comments on this site. I did it for Jody, and then Vernon would say stuff on there. So he gave a third version of where he was that night. So, I mean, we definitely had some significant things come in the 2015, 2016 timeframe that, further, I think, cemented the case. I was able to look into other suspects and I think go a long way toward clearing them. One was Tommy Fulgham, who was, I think, 15 at the time of the murders.
Right.
And, because he killed a young woman in 78, he became a suspect in this. But I think things that I learned from witnesses, people that knew him, I don't think he had anything to do with the Sims murder. And all of these findings that I found I provided to either the sheriff's office, to Willie Meggs, to FDLE, and so forth. And, they were all kept in the loop of what I was doing.
And do you think you found enough to convict back then?
I think what we had in 2016 was certainly enough to
take to trial anyway. Yeah. I
think to have as Mr. Ehrenberg, who is the state attorney down in Palm Beach, said recently in an interview, a prosecutor has to have a good faith belief that they can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. And I think we had that in 2016. Does that mean the case is static? No, I think it never stops. I mean, I think if you get new evidence, if you have other people come forward, you look at everything. And, I know you've talked to Glenn Wall about his theory about the person that may have been the Zodiac and the Sims murder may have been one and the same.
Right.
There have been other people that have approached me about other suspects that perhaps somebody related to the Sims family or somebody related to Marion Hayes, the assistant pastor at the Baptist church. Because this is a case that I think why people are so fascinated with it. There were 15, 20 different suspects over the years. And, it's almost like the Zodiac movie that was made, I think, around 2005, where you get into it and, you go talk to a person and then, he's telling you things and he's getting creepier and creepier, and you're down in the basement with him and you think, you got to run for your life because this guy could be the killer. And the Sims case is kind of like that in the sense that you shine a spotlight and there are all kinds of people doing weird things. And there was another gentleman that was dating one of the Sims daughters that he kind of liked to interject himself into the case as well, and would go talk to Larry Campbell and would say odd things from time to time.
Before you go on, I wanted to ask, because this was on my list of things to ask you about. Who's David Livingston?
Well, that's who I was referring to.
That's what I thought. See, I hadn't seen that name until very recently, and so I kind of wanted to find out who that was, and did he have any connection to that strange phone call that the girls made a couple weeks before the murders to Dr. Sims, asking him to come home early because they were scared of something?
That's one of the baffling parts of this. I don't think it was David that was involved in that. And I think some of the other statements that were made, that apparently it was Vernon Jr. in bushes behind the house that had scared the girls at one point. But it was never established that that incident was the same incident that led the girls to call their father, and he came home early from work, which was rare. It was unusual for him to do so. And from what I recall, I spoke to Dr. Sims' secretary at the time, and she didn't recall whether they named the person by name, but it was something that scared them enough. But I think in the context of them definitely saying on another occasion that Vernon was peeping at them from the bushes and things like that, I don't think that was David at all. David was a little bit older than the Sims girls. He had his own car, and I don't think there was any evidence that he was ever in the bushes and doing stuff like that.
But Vernon was actually seen by a neighbor in the bushes.
Marion Lamb was
yes.
a neighbor down, I think it was down Gibbs Drive, and he would see Vernon hiding behind trees and stuff like that. And I think he told me he come home one night and turned the corner, and his headlights, fell on a tree and saw, I don't know if it was Vernon and Mary Charles or both that were hiding back there. And I don't think David ever did anything like that. But, I mean, he made some statements like he was sitting in the car, and Jenny said something like, if my family could disappear or something like that. I don't think it was anything more than just normal teenage stuff, you go through with your family. I'm sure probably every teenager's probably had some tension with their family and had a thought like that.
Right. Okay. So let's table that right now, because I do want to talk about that. Is there anything else about the inner workings of Tallahassee and this case that you can tell me and my listeners to spread some light on why this case is still not solved?
Well, look at one other factor here, and it was never my intent to sort of tarnish the memory of any person that's deceased. Larry Campbell was a sheriff for a long time, and he passed away, I think, in 2015. But Mike Wood admitted as much, that Larry Campbell kept all the files to the Sims case in his office. And Mike said that if I had touched those files, he would have fired me. And other people also reported that this case was kept in one man's office. Other people that were in that office and saw the files said they were in a mess. And, the purpose of me saying this is not to bash somebody, because, he was day to day. The sheriff had a lot of things he was doing, I'm sure. But you have to look at, why the case might not have been solved. The fact that maybe one man kept it too close of a guard on this. And cases like this have to be a team effort. And you won't solve them if you wear your feelings on the sleeve, because it's no slight on these cases. And you look at any case around the country. Jacksonville solved a number of cold cases here recently, other parts of the country. And when you go open a case, you're not trying to bash the detectives that worked it 20, 30 years ago. You're standing on their shoulders in a lot of ways, and you're building on that. But sometimes you have to go in a new direction, and you have to be open to that and not have your feelings hurt. This case here was just kept in one man's office from the late 80s into the time Larry Campbell passed away. And the case was so inactive at one point, people were making public records requests. I think, in fact, it was Henry Cabbage. And I'm sorry to hear that he's passed away, but he was making public records requests. And Ray Markey, who was the kind of the guru at the state attorney's office, the most brilliant legal mind up there, he said that, we're going to have to give him these records because we can't prove that we have an active investigation on this case. So you look at almost nothing was done on this case in the 90s. There was no effort to go re-interview Mary in the 90s. In the early 2000s, some DNA was submitted, but there was no effort to go re-interview witnesses. There was no effort to, re-interview the Sims daughters at that time. So really nothing was being done from the late 80s when Mary Charles took that ride to Tallahassee up until, a few sporadic things in the 2000s. And then in 2015, my interest in the case grew just because on the 49th anniversary, Dawn Dennis, the detective at the sheriff's office, and I think Mike Wood also talked about it on WCTV, and then Henry Cabbage had his talk. And so that spurred my interest in the case. But they weren't really doing anything with the case other than just talking about it in the media, I'm sorry to say. But I think that's one part of the answer to your question as well. Why would this go unsolved? And, a piece of the puzzle that is a much simpler explanation than nefarious purposes, cover-ups, things like that. Part of it is just nothing was being done on it. And, you have a time period where people are getting much older, starting to pass away, but yet you're not, going out to talk to people before they're gone.
Yeah.
Well, and I think sometimes the number one asset in a cold case, this may be counterintuitive, but, some of the best cold case detectives will tell you this. Some things get better over time because you could have somebody get a divorce or, their spouse pass away and they no longer have those bonds of loyalty that make them stay silent. And you go talk to them and now they're willing to talk about something that they were not going to tell you back in 66. But you didn't have Larry Campbell or Dawn Dennis or any of those people taking advantage of that factor, in this time period. And some of the stuff I found out was just doing the legwork, using the phone book, calling people. I talked to somebody that dated Vernon Fox later, and he told me that, he and Mary Charles had this little scheme in Jacksonville that Vernon would use his good looks and his charm and meet these women, and then Mary Charles would sneak into the houses and rob them. And, she was expert in getting into places without, leaving any hint that she had opened the door. None of that's in the sheriff's office file because they didn't bother to look at that. But I think it's significant because you look at the Sims were people that lock their doors, yet you have, somebody get in there and kill 3 people.
So I want to extend a huge thank you to Jeremy Mutz for taking the time to speak with me and help educate me and my listeners on the inner workings of Tallahassee and some of the reasons believed to have prevented the Sims case from being solved. Massacre on Muriel Court is researched, written, and produced by me, Lauren Samples. If you'd like to support the show, please consider joining our Palmahawk Media Patreon page at patreon.com/Palmahawk Media. That's PALMAHAWK Media. On Patreon, you'll receive early and ad-free episodes of this show and our sister show, Paradise After Dark, along with exclusive content for both shows. Thanks for listening.